and thrust. The aircraft did leave the ground, albeit over a short distance, and came back down to the tragic outcome that you see here. So this is a takeoff gone wrong, which is certainly, there's a sort of rule of thumb some people like to talk about, and that's that if you haven't achieved half of your flying speed within 1/3 of the runway length, you should abort. That's a lot more complicated when you're talking about the calculation of a rejected takeoff for a turboprop or turbine powered aircraft. But for those of us who are flying piston engines with a single propeller, we need to be careful as well and consider that simple rule might be applicable to what we're doing, and also ensure that we're doing all the necessary takeoff performance calculations. Aerodynamic configuration of the airplane is correct for the conditions that we're in. We're using the best runway. If we have to, we're going to use a different day or a different time of day with better air density for maximum performance. And a decision, is this going to work or not? And then it comes down to technique. How much have you really practiced with a flight instructor? Maximum performance takeoffs in an as-needed basis, depending on where it is that you're flying into or flying out of. Now we're going to look at a few accidents that relate to mechanical failure that may be or may not be tied to maintenance. Mechanical failure is not uncommon. However, as owner-operators or someone who rents, it's incumbent upon us to try to do everything practicable to ensure that the aircraft is being maintained to appropriate standards so that we hopefully don't experience any of these types of problems. Some are somewhat simple if we're catching the problem on the ground, but could be catastrophic if they occur in the air. And the problems have to do sometimes with the life-limited performance of a part. There are parts that have to come out of service and be replaced. And I know there's a balancing act between, what the manufacturer might want from a liability limitation perspective and what we might want as owner-operators from a spend perspective. Sometimes procedures will be used that have become obsolete and someone's not staying on top of those. There might be an incorrect process used, and there might be a lack of appropriate oversight depending on who's doing the work. It's possible to be using an incorrect part. Could be a part that's been obsoleted and superseded by a better replacement part for a reason, or occasionally there will be some fraudulent parts that make it into the supply chain. Fortunately, we haven't seen that happen in the New England area for a while. But there is the issue of deferred work and whether or not everything that needs to happen is being done when it needs to happen, or if somebody's working to the legal requirements, but there might be more activity that could happen on the maintenance side to ensure better longevity and performance. So this accident took place in Burlington, Vermont, and it was simply a case of after having done a number of full stop landings, the brakes caught fire. And in order for that to happen, you have to have some exposure of brake fluid to the hot surface. And anyway, fortunately, everyone was able to get out. The fire was put out by the fire crew, but if that fire hadn't been detected on the ground, it could have been a more tragic outcome. And you can see how quickly even a brief fire like that damaged the airframe. This is another fire which took place, again, preliminary, so you can look for the final report on this. The helicopter was coming across Lake Champlain from Plattsburgh to Burlington when the pilot smelled something burning, and they observed smoke in the cockpit and very appropriately initiated a precautionary landing. But in the course of executing that landing, the engine lost power and then lost all power. And so the aircraft performed successful auto rotation to the causeway, and you can see how small that bit of land is out across the lake, and was able to egress the aircraft. Now, in both of those accidents that we've just looked at, being what we would say spry, being able to get out of the aircraft quickly is something that in the Coast Guard we have to practice and be recertified on an annual basis. And it's a case of, maximum 30 seconds, but drill it once a year with the people you fly with on a regular basis, as well as yourself, especially if it's an aircraft like a Piper that has only one door on one side. What's it going to take to get both of you out of there, untangled from headsets and iPads and cables and GoPros and everything else that's common in a cockpit today and get safely on the tarmac and away from the airplane? Can you do both seats and both of you completely out and clear in 30 seconds? So add that to what you do on an annual basis, and it might help you out someday. The other factor there too is the wisdom to understand that a problem is developing and not be sort of dumbstruck by it, but get the aircraft on the ground wherever, however you need to, if there's something catastrophic unfolding like a fire. Now, this is a non-accident, but you can be sure somewhere out there, for at least one flight, there was a Cessna flying around with no wheel nut holding on the wheel. And we know that because the cotter pin is still inserted in the wheel nut, which tells us that the nut wasn't spun on tightly enough and the cotter pin wasn't through the opening on the axle to retain that nut. And yeah, that's something that should have been checked more accurately during the annual inspection or subsequent servicing of the aircraft, or if it's an owner operator performing their own maintenance. Yeah, could have an incident, certainly potentially even an accident if that wheel is lost and then the aircraft loses that wheel on landing or even before landing and comes down on a piece of gear with no wheel attached. So now we have one that pilots are sort of always subjected to looking at other people's mistakes and asking themselves, could this happen to me? So we'll look at a few that are operator error. Now, this graphic on the right shows the most common type of accidents. So descent and landing, taxi and takeoff, we've been through flight maneuvers, fuel mismanagement, and weather-related accidents. In the Boston area and in the New England area, we've seen accidents related to fuel exhaustion or mismanagement, and we've also seen a number of checklist-related accidents. Those checklist-related accidents tend to show up more in corporate aircraft where there's enough automation there now that if it turns out somebody hasn't followed all the appropriate items in the checklist, the aircraft will flag it up and you'll hear the crew call for return to square away whatever issues they have to, and then they'll return to the runway to take off after everything's been sorted. We can do it in a Cessna 182 or in a, any kind of aircraft if we get distracted and fail to deploy the flaps as part of an item on the checklist, or select the correct tank, or what have you, set the mixture, things that are critical to that takeoff activity. So we also see a number of airspace incursion incidents as well, and these are ways to obviously impair your future flying, or certainly have an interview with the FAA, but also, you're going to impinge on other aircraft that might be operating in and out of that Class B or Class D or Class C airspace, or TFRs or prohibited areas, restricted areas, and things of that nature. So these are showing up still in unwelcome numbers. And then with respect to other major issue, runways are always an issue. We see excursions, which we've been through a number of those already, incursions, and issues with lineup or takeoff. I'm showing here a picture of Burlington, Vermont, and that airport is a little bit notorious for lineup and wrong runway or taxiway landing, things of that nature. Could it happen to you? It's possible. It's happened to super professionals in the past too. So use a moving map display, do the research ahead of time, have an airport diagram, look at the hot spots, make sure that you're not going to become somebody sitting down for an interview with someone from the FSDO because you made one of these mistakes. Use the heading indicator, use your moving map, ensure that everything's right about what you're going to do. Make sure your heading indicator is properly aligned with your compass, and is this the right place to be for what I'm about to do? So this is an aircraft landed on a parallel taxiway in Nantucket. And so the aircraft is seen on the video, which is sequestered, so I can't show you the video, but the aircraft lands at the left edge here and rolls out on this taxiway. Well, this taxiway, when you get down to about this point here, is closed. And so the aircraft, which is a PA-28, punches through these barriers, and after that executes a go-around. It was an older pilot, and they stated the sun was a factor in their ability to select the right surface. Certainly there have been some very prominent celebrity pilots that have had issues with this that we know of. So it's something that can happen. There have been a surprising number of people on the Nantucket who've actually just taxied through this barricade as well. So. And then this is a NTSB preliminary. So again, watch for the final on this. The aircraft was going from Henniker, New Hampshire to Minuteman, Massachusetts, and they were going there to buy cheap fuel. En route, the engine quit. It has been reported in local media that there was no fuel aboard after this aircraft landed. We'll wait to see what the NTSB report says on final. They did execute a good forced landing in a large rail yard parking lot. The pilot did want to fly the aircraft out, but inspection by the FAA showed that there was damage to the aircraft firewall and the lower fuselage. And without that damage, this would have been an incident. So because of the damage, the aircraft couldn't be flown out. Now, major issue, pilot currencies. We're seeing a lot of incidents or accidents where there are two pilots in the aircraft. Each one thinks that the other one is qualified, and they're expecting that other pilot to assert themselves as the pilot in command. That's that sort of classic, but I thought you put fuel in, or but I thought you had a valid medical, but I thought your BFR was current, but I thought you knew how to fly a twin. And those things are showing up. We're also seeing instruction taking place where the instructor is not current or rated. And so it's important that you ensure that anyone you're flying with and you yourself are fully qualified and current as necessary on all of the credentials you need. And frankly, that the aircraft is too, in terms of the testing intervals for the avionics and the pedostatic system and what have you. And then drugs and alcohol. So this is very disappointing to see as a lifetime aviator. We're seeing a lot of involvement of drugs and alcohol in accident investigations. And if you look at this chart, which is 1990 to 2012, that value is about 23%. I can tell you that it's nudging 40% now. And the type of drugs we'll look at in more detail later. It's hard to find these on an accident unless there's a fatality, because people may not present themselves. Police are being asked to conduct essentially what amounts to a field sobriety check if they are first responders to an aircraft accident. Just because it's an airplane doesn't mean that they can't get involved in that type of analysis. And when we look at the age group for drug use, we can see that as people get older, the use of drugs increases. Obviously, some of those are for treating medical conditions that are reported to their AME with drugs that are approved by FAA. But there are also drugs being used that indicate the potential for a disqualifying or impairing condition, and as well as drugs that are known to be impairing. And then we have the two small categories, which are controlled substances and illicit drugs. And now we look at the distribution of use by type of certification, and it's the recreational flyer more than any other, and in particular the sport pilot community, where we see the highest levels of drugs occurring in the accident studies. And that, again, these numbers have been increasing since this data set was compiled in 2012. Now, we've looked at a number of accidents. They're all examples of things that have been happening in and around New England during the past year, but safety is more than just avoiding those accidents. We also want to avoid the incidents. And we know that on national basis, about 2.5 to 3 incidents for every accident. We don't hear about all of them because Part 91 is not required to report incidents. 3 incidents in Rhode Island, 15 in Massachusetts, and one of the places these show up is in insurance claims for accidents that are never reported or for incidents that don't require reporting. So in this case, we have a couple of Cirrus aircraft parked on the ramp. Their passengers are unloading baggage. And then we've got a Global Express whose jet blast spins one of these aircraft around, scatters baggage, and gets people running. And both of these Cirrus aircraft were damaged as a result of having one wing dragged over the other wing. Now, are we really being safe in what we do? The person who laid these blocks out on the railroad tracks, I guess they thought that this was safe. but what's going to happen when a train comes along and hits those, which are fine for use on a road, but it's just going to cause a disaster with a train derailment and do nothing to protect that fire hose. So, look at what you're doing, try to make sure that you're not normalizing deviations from good behavior, you haven't picked up bad habits, and get a flight instructor